On to chapter 3 in the group of animals, but we'll talk a little bit about chapter 2. I do this, I turn the video off and then realize there's a couple of things I could have put up there. This one's just a bad joke. Tell me again about your uncle, famous biologist. Uncle Albert won many awards for his work in breeding sea anemones. Sadly, he had little time for a social life. With anemones like that, who needs friends? You know, dad joke, really. So here's the stinging cell, here's the stinging cell unstung, here's the polyp form, here's the medusa form, here's the jellyfish, here's the sea anemone. These are a different group. They used to be assumed to be related to the Cnidaria, but now are not considered. They're called comb jellies. This is one of the larval forms. And this is a very simple larval form that these guys have. That's very flat, planula, like a plane or a plate. And there's something that happens sometimes. A mutation will produce what's called precocious adulthood, where a larval form will become reproductive before it actually becomes the adult form. And the assumption is that that happened, a mutation happened in these that led to the next group that we're going to talk about. So it kind of makes sense that I have this here. These are the flatworms. I put this technical name up because sometimes it's kind of interesting. Platyhelminthes. Platy means flat, helminthes means worms. So both of those say flatworms, just one of them says it in Latin. You know, longer and looks more official. Now these guys literally are flat. There's a problem you get as animals get bigger, is that they live in the water. Right? Early evolution happened in the water, in the oceans. But as the animals get bigger, the outside, where the oxygen is, the oxygen needs to get to all of the cells on the inside. And the cells on the very inside get farther and farther away from the surface where the oxygen is. Also, the ones on the inside are producing waste materials that have to get out into the water. And if they're too far in, they have to go through a bunch of cells that they could be toxifying on the way out. One of the ways around that is to set up a distribution system. Is that move stuff around so that you can pick up oxygen and bring it in, you can pick up waste and take them out, and they're not just diffusing through all the layers in between. Another way to do it is to make sure all of your cells are somewhere near a surface. And you can do that if you're really flat. And these are very flat. They don't tend to be huge animals, but I mean, some of them get to be about this size. You look at it from the side, they're flat as a piece of paper. So the cells in the very middle of an animal that's shaped like this, it's flat, they're still close to a surface. These got the outer layer, these got the inner layer. They now have a middle layer. Huge evolutionary development. It allows for tissues and internal organs and organ systems. The difference in complexity between the Cnidaria and the flatworms is just amazing. Is that you have fully formed nervous system, fully formed digestive system, fully formed reproductive systems, fully formed muscular systems. lots and lots of stuff. All kind of a continuous cell matrix, except for the internal spaces of things like the digestive system and some of the tubes that lead stuff in and out. But all the cells are kind of connected to all the other cells. That winds up being a bit of an issue, and we'll see a solution to that in a later group. This makes me realize I skipped something. In the Cnidaria, you have a body setup that's called radial symmetry. Is that if you look down on the animals, they are round, and the symmetry, the balance in the animals is pie slices. That, depending on how they're set up, like a sea anemone is octoradially symmetrical. So you're looking down at the top of a sea anemone, and any pie slice that's an eighth of the animal, you take another pie slice that's an eighth, all the same stuff will be in it. Is that they have repetition in every eighth. In the medusas that we look at in the lab, they are quadraradially symmetrical. They're in quarters. So every pie slice that's a quarter will have the same stuff in it that any other pie slice that's a quarter is. Radially, radii, like in a circle, radially symmetrical. There are some groups where that happens. There'll be more later on. This is much more typical. Bilateral symmetry, symmetry of two sides like we have. If you have a single thing, it tends to be in the middle. If you have more than one thing, there tends to be a reflection right side and left side. There is another thing that's associated with bilateral symmetry. Cephalization. When animals are bilaterally symmetrical, as they move along, they tend to have drivers on both sides, which tends to push them in a particular direction, which tends to give them a front end. That's the end that's running into the world before the rest of the animal does. So what evolution tends to do now that there's nervous systems developing is it tends to put a lot of sensory apparatus at the front end, and that requires processors. So bilateral symmetry naturally lends itself to the development, the evolution of a head end with everything that entails. You'll have some processors on the back end too, because things do sneak up on you. But the fact that you're always leading with the same end requires kind of a head processing end, and that's what you see. You don't quite get, you get what I call ganglia in these guys, collections of nerves. Not real brains yet, although I may tell you the story about being outsmarted by flatworms. I don't think I'll have room enough on this video to do it. Maybe I'll do a separate video on it. But cephalization, a lot of bilateral animals, they tend to have head ends. Look at us. Is it? We're weird. Is that we don't lead with our head end, but our ancestors did. There's three major subgroups. The Turbellaria, who look like they party all the time. Two of the three groups are parasites. A group that is found just living in the environment, that term is free living. They don't depend on, they don't live on or in another living thing. And Turbellaria are free living. The flatworms that we look at in the lab, the planaria, are free living. They're in the Turbellarians. These guys mostly live in the water. There's a few species that live on land, but they live like under the leaf litter where it's really wet. They don't do well dried out, is that they need wetness around them. This is true for the other groups too, where they live inside living things where it's pretty wet. Let's see, what am I doing next? We run into this alternation of generations for parasites again. And again, two different hosts. An intermediate host for asexual stages, which in trematodes is usually a mollusk, usually a snail of some sort. They tend to be very particular about their snails. And the definitive host, where sexual reproduction happens, is usually some sort of backboned animal. There's flukes that live in all sorts of different animals, including humans. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things we look at and draw in the lab is the Chinese liver fluke. Chinese liver fluke lives in your liver, little bitty guys. And they eat your liver cells, and they reproduce. Now, they can reproduce by themselves. They have male and female parts. They reproduce sexually, but they can produce sperm and eggs and sort out their genes. But they can also reproduce with each other. And so if there's more than one worm there, they were successful enough in getting there, they can combine possibly those successful features and produce an even more successful generation. And they lay eggs. Eggs travel down the ducts from your liver that go into your digestive system, and you pass the eggs. In the case of Chinese liver flukes, the eggs need to get into a body of water. Their intermediate hosts is a snail that lives in the water, aquatic snail. And they reproduce asexually in the snail. Eventually, what comes out of the snail is lots and lots and lots of little swimmy larvae that get picked up by little predatory animals, but they are resistant to being digested. They will bore out of the digestive system and settle in the tissues. And so that little animal will get eaten by a bigger animal. Same thing happens. Get eaten by a bigger animal. Same thing happens. These are called vector hosts. They're getting the parasite from one host to another, but the parasite isn't really doing anything in them except being carried. They work their way up the food chain until they're in a fish big enough to be eaten by a human. In lots of places in East Asia, I'm sure you know about sushi, there's a lot of fish recipes that don't involve cooking the fish. Cooking would kill these worms. Just marinating the fish doesn't do that. And so you eat the contaminated raw fish. The larvae come out in your digestive system. Again, they resist digestion. The larvae crawl up into your liver, become adults, and the cycle is complete. Started in a human's liver, winds up in a human's liver. If there's not very many of them, they don't tend to be really, really dangerous. And treating them can be a little dangerous. There's toxins that you use to kill the worms that if you don't use enough, you don't kill the worms, and if you use too much, you can kill the host. So people that, say, went to Asia and picked up a couple and then came back here where there are no compatible snails, that's why we don't have them here, we don't have the right snails. They don't, sometimes they don't get treated. You got a very large liver that can handle a lot of little bitty damage. So sometimes not even worth it. Name one, and my pet trematodes. There is a trematode that is particularly dangerous. There are other ones that exist in people, but these are the ones I'm going to talk about. These are typically found, the World Health Organization has a hit list of diseases that need to be eradicated because they have a very large health and economic impact. These guys are near the top of the list. They used to be at the top of the list before they were bumped down by HIV. Then probably coronavirus. I haven't looked at the list lately. But schistosomes produce schistosomiasis. So, again, asexual reproduction happens in water snails, freshwater snails. And the larvae that come out of the freshwater snails look for the right sort of skin to bore into, and then the larvae migrate up into your body cavity here and settle out in the tissues around either your intestine for one species or your bladder for another species. One species across the Middle East, the other species in East Asia. And but they're not in the bladder or in the digestive system. They're just right underneath the lining. And that's the sexual stage, so they recombine their genetics, and they actually have separate males and females in schistosomes. Although that becomes weird because once they get together, they kind of fuse into one worm. Here's where it gets dangerous. They need to get their eggs out of your body, but they aren't actually in the space of your digestive system or your bladder. So as the eggs come out of the female, they have a spike on them. And they're right on the bottom of the thin lining. The spike tends to tear a hole and they drop into the space. And then away they go, either out your digestive system or out through your urinary system. And you pass them into water. They get into the snails. There we go again. In rice paddies, it's a big deal. Any place where Western irrigation techniques with a lot of irrigation ditches have been introduced, it's a big deal. Where people walk into the water to get their water, it's a big deal. There's a lot of places where schistosomes are pretty bad, and they're not easy to treat. They are treatable, but it's not easy. Here's the thing. Those spiky eggs, they don't always leave. Sometimes they get picked up in the fluid drainage system of the digestive system or the bladder and wind up in your circulatory system. So you have these spiky eggs tumbling through your smaller blood vessels, ripping the holy hell out of them. And so that makes them pretty deadly. And so schistosomiasis is a very, very dangerous disease because the eggs that don't get out can do a lot. Any place you got a lot of small blood vessels, brain, your lungs, your kidneys, a lot of places they can do damage to. We do have a local schistosome, but it doesn't infect humans. It infects water birds, like geese and loons and stuff. But if you're swimming at a time of the year when there's a lot of larvae in the water, because again, they're using a water snail that come out and they're worm larvae. They're not the brightest things in the world. They come up against your skin, and it kind of sort of tastes like bird skin. They will penetrate and wander under the surface of your skin. Your immune system's not crazy about that. You'll get itchy and rashes and stuff. If it gets in your eyes, it could be bad, but it's not going to hurt you. They can't reproduce in you. They don't invade you the way that human schistosomes do. But it causes what's called swimmer's itch. Some people have told me around here it's sometimes called duck itch. When we first moved into this area, and there was a public beach in Corona Lake, the first summer we were here, they closed it because of an outbreak of swimmer's itch. So yeah, they do. It does happen around here. So if you go swimming and you come out and you're itchy, that may be why. That's our local schistosome. And as I said, there's a lot of other flukes that infect people. There's flukes that infect virtually any kind of backboned animal you can think of. They can be fairly dangerous. The third group, another parasite group, are the tapeworms, technically called the cestodes. I don't care, you can call them tapeworms, that's fine. They tend to be, as adults, they're long, flat, white strings that attach in your digestive system, and then behind their little head end, which is called the scolex, you'll see these in the lab. They just make little series of reproductive packets. The farther back you go, the longer they've been growing. These are new, these are older. They mature, and they're purely sexual reproductive packets. Some tapeworms can bend over and reproduce one packet with another packet, reproduce by themselves. They can also reproduce with other tapeworms that are in there. Typically, an adult tapeworm in your digestive system isn't dangerous. So a lot of them control their own population, like Giardia does, where they won't let there be a buildup of a lot of them. And some people develop allergies to some of their products, so that can be an issue with people that have tapeworms. If your dog or cat has a tapeworm, sometimes that happens, and it makes them feel, they don't eat as much. That's often a symptom of dog or cat having a tapeworm. Also, they pass, in some cases, they pass just the eggs. The oldest packets on the back have all done their reproducing. They become a bag of eggs. Most of the time in tapeworms, they pop open and the eggs pass out the back end of the animal, and that's the way they get into their intermediate hosts, which can be a lot of different types of animals. One of the more common tapeworms around here, cats get, and because they tend to bury their stuff, is that what comes out their back end is a whole packet, but it is movable. So it can actually crawl from where the cat's buried it up onto the surface, and then it breaks open and the eggs are out there. And the intermediate hosts for those are fleas. Fleas drop eggs off your cat, the flea eggs hatch, and they become these little maggoty looking larvae that just browse around and eat a bunch of stuff, including tapeworm eggs. And then they eventually develop, convert into an adult flea. They transform, metamorphosis. And they get on a cat, and the cat, licking its fur, biting at an itch, will swallow the flea, and now they've got the next generation of tapeworm. Some tapeworms, their intermediate host, they pick the eggs up. The larvae burrow out of the digestive system and settle someplace, because in order to get into their final host, they want this host to get eaten. So they can settle almost anywhere. And sometimes they settle, and you're the intermediate host, they're doing asexual reproduction, they are becoming a big old worm larva. And that can be dangerous, is they can settle in places where they damage tissues. For a particular type of dog tapeworm that is very small as an adult, so it can produce huge numbers of larvae, because in a dog there's a lot of room for them to be adult tapeworms if the dog tapeworms are little. And those larvae can get very large if there's room for them wherever they settle in the human. We're not a typical intermediate host for that, but we are. And if your dog eats you, which they don't tend to do, your cat might. If you die, they're there. Your dogs don't. But the larvae can be dangerous. They can mimic tumors. They don't look like a tumor on an x-ray, but they push on surrounding issues the same way. They can grow in a bone and the bone will spontaneously break. There you do develop an allergy to the fluid inside the, what they call a bladder worm, and that can be dangerous. Just taking them out, surgically removing them, you gotta be really careful to suck all the fluid out and replace it with saline before you do anything, because if you nick it and the fluid leaks onto tissues, you get a huge allergic reaction and it can kill the person while you're trying to get them out. This is a planarian, just a cross section to show you some of the tissues and the systems inside. That shows your systems a little bit better. Chinese liver fluke. Liver out to the snail, goes through some stages in the snail, gets out into the water, work its way up into fish where it's embedded in the fish muscles, gets back to the person. This is what the adult fluke looks like. There's all these different reproductive system, digestive system, yolk producing system and excretion system. Little suckers that it attaches with. There's a sucker there as well. Tapeworm, the skullex, the head end, suckers, and a ring of little shallow hooks that help it. You remember your intestines are very foldy, so they can just stick that into a fold and hang on. And then it just grows and grows and grows and grows. These are the what are called proglottids, the reproductive structures. And these will get more and more mature and eventually be a bag full of eggs. There's the larva, has the same name as the larva in the cnidarians. Here's your, actually that's a different one. Here's a fluke, here's a turbularian. There's a couple of other things on here that we're gonna ignore. And here's a tapeworm. Well, I'm not sure if we can afford stomach insurance. Right now, we're trying to put the kids through the small intestine. They don't live in your stomach. They can get through your stomach acid to your actual intestines, which is where they actually live. Stomach acid is not things to get in farther into your digestive system. They need to be able to survive your stomach acid, but very few things are happy living in your stomach acid. So almost everything that's a digestive parasite is in your intestines, where they have to resist digestive enzymes, but they don't at least have to resist acid. Your intestines are not acidic. Okay, that's it for another chapter.